His opponents have again and again predicted these apocalypses, and again they've been disproved, and as a result, they're not sure how to even frame their own objections to what Trump is doing. And it's one reason why you have something like the No Kings protests, which is completely devoid of substance. It has been very amusing to see establishment economists who, again, were predicting the end of the world and certainly something like a Great Depression taking hold in America, having to quickly reverse themselves. Antifa, of course, supposedly stands for anti-fascist, but in reality, the brown shirt tactics that Antifa follows are precisely the tactics that Mussolini's brown shirts had followed.
Having a VPN or virtual private network has never been more necessary, especially if you live in the UK. The Online Safety Act means so much content is now being blocked on social media, including news and even speeches made in Parliament. But a solution is at hand with the help of our partners at Private Internet Access, or PIA for short. PIA is the VPN I use and trust. In case you don't know, a VPN, or virtual private network, is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel. Whenever you are browsing online on an unprotected device, your device is transmitting a lot of information out into the open, which can be seen by multiple parties before it reaches the website you're trying to visit. Instead of giving away your personal information and your location to the world, PIA lets you change your IP address to one of 91 countries. This means you can gain access to websites and services that are only available in those locations. And it's not just that. Did you know that streaming services like Netflix and Prime Video have huge catalogs of content, but you can only access a fraction of it from your own country? Using PIA to change your location opens up a whole new world of streaming. I love it. Paying for Netflix without using PIA is a bit like paying for front row seats at the cinema but being forced to sit in the hallway. I also use it all the time when I'm traveling to catch up with what's going on at home. Because PIA is available for all platforms, I never need to worry about my safety or my privacy. It works on Windows, Apple Macs, iPhones, Android, and more. Even better, you only need one subscription to protect yourself across all the devices you own. So, sign up now to the world's most transparent VPN provider and take advantage of our special offer. Viewers of my show can get 86% off a subscription to Private Internet Access. So that's just £1.67 per month. And you also get an extra 4 months thrown in completely for free. To take advantage of this incredible deal, just go to piavpn.com/Brendan. That's piavpn.com/Brendan. Signing up is totally risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. You won't regret it. Sign up now at piavpn.com/Brendan. Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Daniel McCarthy. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brendan.
So, Daniel, I want to talk to you about America. And this is an area of expertise for you, one of your areas of expertise. People will be familiar with your writing on American politics and Trump and all the rest of it in The Spectator and many other places too. So there's a lot to talk about where America is at right now. But I actually want to start off by asking you about No Kings, because it was, to me, it was very comedic. I enjoyed the memes and the piss taking very much. It even made waves over here. And American politics isn't making as big waves over here as it was a few years ago. But No Kings was covered here. People made fun of it here. I like to see boomers having a day out, and that seems to have been what a lot of it was. But how do you see the No Kings protest? What was it about, and how did it land in America?
I'm not even sure I could describe exactly what it's about. As the label indicates, this was a very quixotic kind of demonstration. This was a very aged crowd getting out, and basically it's an anti-Trump protest, but they don't have any particular issue that they want to organize around. So it wasn't a protest about immigration. It wasn't a protest about foreign policy. This was simply being upset that Donald Trump is president. It was a protest against the fact that he won the last election. And rather than having any particular concrete thing to complain about, they've decided to try to brand Donald Trump as a king. But even then, these protests were labeled, no kings plural, as if Charles and any number of other monarchs are the target of their ire. So it really didn't make a lot of sense. This was simply an opportunity for boomers to leave the old folks home, go get some sunshine. They did come out in large numbers, it's true, but I don't see that there's any real political force behind this excursion that they had 2 days ago. It was an object mostly of mockery and of amusement.
The thing that struck me is that it seems that 1776 is back in vogue. For the past few years, it was all about 1619. The founding date of America was the arrival of the slaves, not the revolutionary period that gave rise to the American Republic, American democracy. And I saw some protesters saying, look, we got rid of kings once before, we can do it again with Donald Trump. There was this attempt to reclaim that kind of revolutionary spirit of America. But of course, that doesn't really wash, does it? Because these are some of the same people, at least, I guess some of the younger ones in particular, who actually were rubbishing that period for the past few years.
It's true, although there are so few young people involved in these protests that, now that you mention it, some of these folks probably remember the year 1776. So they were around the first time we got rid of our king. Yeah, you've got the American 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence coming up next year. So there is a bit of that spirit. But the other thing is that these protests seem to be very loosely modeled on the Tea Party protests that the right generated a decade or so back against Barack Obama. But of course, the Tea Party was actually about something, and it was about taxes in particular, and the bailouts that had been provided by both George W. Bush and Barack Obama to American financial institutions, in the wake of the Great Recession. Whereas the No Kings protest, even though it tries to invoke this kind of colonial, rebellion against monarchy, it doesn't have the concrete, momentum that you had with the Tea Party. It's not organic. Instead, it really does seem like, again, they're so desperate to have anything with which to organize around and to criticize Trump, and yet it's strange to me that they don't simply call this an anti-Trump protest. They call it No Kings. They try to pretend there's a bigger issue at stake, but there really isn't. And as a result, it's very hard to see what effect they're going to have either on the midterm elections or on the elections we have coming up in a few of our states next week.
Does it tell us anything about the temperature of, I guess, the American left or the Democrats? I mean, it has been, people have made fun of it, as you say, both in the US and in the UK. The thing that struck me is that I thought Trump derangement syndrome was on its last legs. Maybe I was being overly optimistic, but I thought that certainly that hysteria that we saw during the first Trump administration had kind of petered out. Even here in the UK, where the left organized itself bizarrely around hating Trump, there's much less of that now. I think people have woken up to the fact that tens of millions of working Americans want this man in the White House, and that's how democracy works. What does it tell us about Trump derangement syndrome? Do you think No Kings is the death rattle of that movement, or does that movement still have legs in the United States? What's the coastal opinion? Where does that stand right now in relation to Trump?
There's still such a thing as Trump derangement syndrome, but I will say I think what No Kings demonstrates more than anything is a great generational divide that has taken hold. And it does seem as if the older generation, especially the older generation of liberals and progressives, they're having difficulty accepting what the 21st century looks like. They still want to live in the 20th century. They want to believe that a number of things they took for granted about the sacredness of the New Deal and the sacredness of the dispensation in politics at the end of the 20th century, they want to believe that all of this still pertains, and that Donald Trump is some sort of aberration and an abomination that should not be happening. And really, all that's doing is giving a sense that you have, these folks now who are in their 70s or older, perhaps, who just seem completely out of touch with where the country actually is. You do have a young left, which is quite militant. You do have younger Democratic candidates like Zohran Mamdani, who's about to be elected mayor of New York, most likely in 2 weeks here, who do have, a kind of socialist momentum to themselves, who do have, various degrees. I mean, they get out and they protest, against the existence of Israel, and they're very pro-Palestinian. So you do have a certain amount of vitality on the left. But the No Kings didn't symbolize that. No Kings was much more, it really was kind of the fading echo of this boomer generation. Kind of, they remembering their glory days of protesting other conflicts, and whether it's the Iraq War or Vietnam. And so even though they're not protesting a conflict this time, it's their opportunity to kind of relive the sorts of actions they've taken in the past. And as a result, they just seemed kind of, like they were going through the motions, as if they were, a record stuck on repeat.
So let's talk a little bit more about Trump and how Trump is faring. I mean, one thing that I've noticed, and I'm sure many others have as well, is that there's this kind of malarial obsession with Trump and the danger he poses to the world. And it kind of explodes into the Western conscience and then it kind of dissipates quite quickly. Think about recent issues like the very brief war with Iran, for example, which we were told by numerous people on the right as well as the left, this was going to be the Third World War. It was a disaster. The whole of Europe would be dragged in. It would just be chaos. Or if you think about tariffs and the imposition of tariffs, again, there were dire warnings about what would happen as a consequence of Trump's tariffs to the global economy and maybe even to global peace. There was talk of the 1930s and the chaos that might ensue from these tariffs, these grotesque, unfair tariffs, etc., etc. And both of those issues kind of dissipated slightly. They proved not to be as disastrous as we were told. Do you think that's the kind of general tone of anti-Trumpism, is that it becomes incredibly obsessed with something he does, but it doesn't actually pan out in the way they tell us it will?
That's right, and this has been very discrediting for a lot of Trump's critics, and it's one reason why you have something like the No Kings protests, which is completely devoid of substance, devoid of any kind of issue or particular topic that they want to cover. Democrats are very wrong-footed right now, and they very much feel like they can't quite come out and say that they completely reject Trump's immigration policy because, of course, it's very popular with the American people, or at least the idea of stopping illegal immigration and sending illegal immigrants back to their own countries is very popular. They can't say that they're against Trump's trade policy because, of course, it's actually quite popular with the working class, and the idea of, America favoring its own industries is something that Democrats would find themselves in a very awkward position if they said we should favor global imports instead. And similarly on foreign policy, you can't mobilize the masses against a war that Trump is fighting because, in fact, Trump is ending wars rather than starting them or getting us deeply involved in them. And that was true with the very brief war between Iran and Israel that he ended with just, a single set of strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities. It's true with this new Gaza deal, which hopefully will hold up. So his opponents have again and again predicted these apocalypses, and again they've been disproved. And as a result, they're not sure exactly how to even frame their own objections to what Trump is doing. And I think this applies perhaps to some degree, and you would know better than I would, at the global level as well. That all of these kind of shocked responses from the establishment worldwide, and certainly in Western Europe, have basically been shown to be hysterical responses. And more and more, I think people realize, Trump he's on to something. Even if you don't like his style, even if you think he's too abrasive, that he has correctly identified where not only the American public is, but where very large proportions, if not majorities, of much of the public in Western Europe and elsewhere, where they are as well on many of these questions of globalization, immigration, and other matters.
Yeah, I think if, editorial writers at Europe's liberal broadsheets were to look back on stuff they've written just over the past year, they would presumably be mortified. I mean, the dire warnings they have issued in relation to every major policy Trump has come up with have just been, as you say, hysterical, really, off the boil stuff, and it just has not come to pass in the way that they said it would. Um, I wanted to ask you about some of those specific policies that Trump has pursued and the impact that they're having in America and the impact you think they might be having globally. So let's talk about the trade policy, for example. And as you describe it, an effort by Trump, which he did promise to do, to restore American industry, to reshore some of those jobs that had been sent overseas, to prioritize, I guess, America's internal economic interests over the requirements of global capital or globalism. There was the tariffs, of course. There have been other measures too. How is that going? Am I right in thinking that even some pretty anti-Trump economists have had to admit that actually it's not that bad, not as bad as they thought it was going to be? And as you say, of course, it's popular amongst the American working class. How is that trade policy panning out so far?
It has been very amusing to see establishment economists who, again, were predicting the end of the world and certainly something like a Great Depression taking hold in America, having to quickly reverse themselves. And there were a few economists who were critical but didn't have quite the same degree of apocalyptic fever. And it's interesting to see the profession as a whole, the economists, take cover behind those few who were rather more moderate in their criticisms, rather than the great swath of the field that was, in fact, very much, predicting doom and destruction. Um, so the trade policy is still in its early phases, and you've got kind of the initial shock of not only the economic establishment, but also in some cases the business establishment as well. Regarding what Trump is doing and exactly how long this is going to last, what the magnitude of these tariffs is going to be. And you also have the rest of the world gradually reacting and trying to work out deals and realizing Trump is not bluffing. He really will, not only slap general tariffs on everyone, but he will go to, quite extraordinary lengths with massive tariffs on anyone that he feels is getting into a tit for tat with him. It's very interesting to see the political reactions around the world. I think the selection of a new prime minister in Japan, who's the first female prime minister in Japan, but who's also something of a protege of Prime Minister Abe, who, of course, had a very good rapport with President Trump. I think that is a response to the tariffs and to what Trump is doing. I think governments around the world are realizing that they have to take this seriously, and that may mean that they have to move somewhat to the right, and they have to be able to form a certain kind of common feeling with Trump in order to get Trump to look favorably upon them in making trade deals. So there's a very much a strong diplomatic component and a kind of strategic global political component to what Trump's doing, as well as an attempt to help American industry. It's going to take time to see whether American industry really can take the opportunity they've been offered by Trump to strengthen themselves, to reinvest in American factories and American workers. Right now, the business community does feel a certain amount of uncertainty. And, there's some fear that even if Trump is consistent about these policies over the next 3 years, ultimately you don't know who's going to take charge after 2028, and you don't know if this is going to continue or if there will be a sudden reversion to the kind of globalism that had been pursued for decades. I think more and more business leaders are coming to the conclusion that there will not be a reversion because even Democrats realize that the American working class wants to see some measure of protection, remain after Trump. But as I say, it's still early days, and there's still a lot of dust to settle before we know exactly what the long-term trajectory is going to look like.
And what impact has the trade policy had not in relation to the economy as such, but in relation to domestic American politics? For example, what is the response of the libertarian right or the free market right? The fact that you've got this guy who seems pretty keen and pretty intent on using the power of the state or the muscle of his office to impose certain rules and restrictions on how trade is carried out. And that runs counter to their belief system, their belief in a kind of completely unfettered market, although such a thing has never actually existed. Um, you wrote recently in The Spectator, I think it was, about, I don't know, maybe a possible socialist element to the Trump administration, or certainly an element where he is very content to use the state to exert certain policies and to influence the economy. What's been the response on that kind of free market side of politics to what Trump is doing?
Yeah, there is a sort of dead-end element of the American right, broadly speaking, particularly its libertarian element, which is just completely alienated from the Trump administration, doesn't want to give him credit for anything, precisely because Trump is murdering a sacred cow here, slaughtering it, by rejecting free trade dogma. And, it's very interesting because on the one hand, libertarians, are very keen on freedom. They're very keen on, free trade, but they really don't have a lot of intellectual freedom oftentimes. And any deviation from their dogma tends to upset them the way it would upset religious fanatics. So they're very unhappy with Trump. They have all of their hopes set right now on the Supreme Court delivering them and acting as their savior. So they're hoping that the Supreme Court will strike down President Trump's power to enact tariffs unilaterally. This is a power that Congress has given the president as a kind of emergency measure, and this was something that's been written back into American laws going back decades. So it's not a novel thing, but Trump is using it in a much more aggressive and rather novel way. And so there's a hope among libertarians that the Supreme Court will say this is excessive, this law should never have been passed, and that they'll take away Trump's power, nullify his tariffs, and send the issue back to Congress. I tend to think that the Supreme Court will not go that far. The Supreme Court probably does not want to get itself into the middle of this policy issue. It probably does not want to rebuke both Congress and the president. Congress for giving the president this power, the president for using it. I think the Supreme Court is a little more modest about its own role in things than that. But we'll find out in the months to come.
I think you're absolutely right in what you say about sections of the libertarian right in America, and I'm friends with some of them, and I've spoken at some of their conferences, and there's some good people, but there is sometimes a dogmatic conviction to free trade, and anyone who deviates from it is seen as basically a sinner, a moral transgressor. And I've noticed some of that in their criticisms of Trump, and they often suffer from Trump derangement syndrome as much as sections of the Democrats do. What impact has Trump's trade policies had on the left in American politics? You talk about how even the Democrats seem to be realizing that the American working class wants some form of protectionism to carry on into the future beyond this Trump administration. I hope they have made that realization and they don't go back to the old globalist ways. What about the left more broadly? Has the left had any pause for thought about the fact that Trump is doing things that the working classes like, that seems to be devoted to protecting working class jobs, creating more working class jobs, restoring some of those jobs that had previously been lost? Have any sensible wings of the left stopped and thought, actually, this might be the kind of thing we would have done a couple of decades ago in order to ensure a higher standard of working class living? Has that taken place at all?
Yeah, that used to be the bread and butter of the Democratic Party. That used to be the sort of the core of its political coalition. And that hasn't been the case since Bill Clinton in the 1990s. And even now, it seems as if Democrats are very reluctant to acknowledge that President Trump is right and certainly is well aligned with a working class constituency here. So Democrats, they're smart enough to realize that their old policies had failed, but they're not smart enough to have or courageous enough to adopt Trump's policies or to be very clear and bold about staking out a more pro-working class approach. It's interesting because a few Democrats who do have both a more pro-working class approach and also who have been willing to put a little bit of distance between themselves and sort of the radical pro-Palestinian left or various other, sort of radical elements on the American left. People like Senator Fetterman in Pennsylvania. These Democrats are isolated within their own party, and they are often attacked by their own party, even sometimes by their own staffers. And it's very interesting because Senator Fetterman has good enough approval ratings that he could get reelected in his state, but he probably can't get his own party's nomination again. So he's kind of in the position that someone like Senator Sinema was, just a few years ago when she was in Congress. And she was so broadly loathed by her own party that she had very little chance of, in fact, no chance of getting renominated. So the Democrats are having a little bit of a civil war amongst themselves about whether to be moderate, whether to cultivate sort of the middle of America, or whether they are going to try rolling the dice on any number of radical new approaches. The Democrats, there is a little bit of momentum, as I alluded to earlier, for the Democratic Socialists and for candidates like Zohran Mamdani. But of course, Mamdani is running in New York City. If you look at some of the data behind the polls, it's interesting that Mamdani polls much better among first-generation New Yorkers, among New Yorkers who are immigrants, than he does among New Yorkers who were born in America. And so it's not so much that Mamdani is succeeding in using socialism to appeal to working-class New Yorkers. It's rather that Zohran Mamdani is seen as being in some ways, a candidate for immigrants and for people who don't identify with, sort of the older politics of America. So that may be the future of the Democratic Party, that they want to have more candidates like Mamdani who can run effectively in cities and who are, kind of representative of a new demographic element, whereas the old, center of the Democratic Party focusing on the American working class, that so far seems to be something they're having a great deal of trouble reclaiming.
I did want to ask you about that, the trouble they're having with the working class. And you wrote recently about the decoupling of the Democratic Party from the working class in America. And there's been, whenever one reads the statistics about this and the shifts that have taken place, it is really extraordinary. And of course, we see something very similar in Europe. Pretty much all the parties of labor or the parties of social democracy have increasingly become, the playthings of the upper middle classes, and working class voters have shifted either to conservative parties or populist parties, and or Nigel Farage's Reform Party in the UK is one example. In your piece, you called it the Clinton curse, and you've mentioned Bill Clinton already. And do you think it stems from that period in the 1990s? And what exactly has it entailed, this decoupling? What were the causes of it? And I guess, what are the hopes that it could ever be patched together again, or is that just not going to happen?
Yeah, I recently wrote about just how phenomenally successful the working class New Deal coalition that Franklin Roosevelt built in the 1930s and 1940s was. This was a coalition which controlled the White House. Democrats had the White House under the 4 terms that Franklin Roosevelt won, as well as the subsequent term by Harry Truman. So that's 20 straight years of Democratic power in Washington, D.C., in the White House. The coalition that Roosevelt put together then controlled the House of Representatives, the lower house in Congress, for about 40 consecutive years, all the way from the 1950s until the mid-1990s. It finally lost that 40-year winning streak in the House of Representatives was finally broken when Bill Clinton was president. And interestingly enough, even before then, the Democrats tended to predominate in Congress from the 1930s onwards. And there were only 2 brief interruptions, but then those interruptions were quickly overcome, and the Democrats reclaimed power at 2 points in the 1940s and early 1950s. The Democrats have not been able to permanently reclaim power since the Bill Clinton era. So they've occasionally controlled, Congress, either in the House or in the Senate or both, but they've not been able to hold on to power the way they did during the New Deal era. And that really is, I think, because the Democrats have completely walked away from what had made them successful during that prolonged Franklin Roosevelt legacy era. They've walked away from the kind of more common sense and, in fact, more of a mosaic approach to these cultural issues. So it used to be that the Democrats had both a left wing and a right wing culturally, or at least a centrist wing. Now they only have a left wing. Now they only have a wing which embraces transgenderism and all of these radical new social movements, and which finds it extremely difficult to back away from whatever the latest cause du jour is. And then on the economic front, the Democrats, they, without actually becoming a party of smaller government, they never became libertarians or small government Republicans. They nonetheless embraced the idea of, prioritizing Wall Street, prioritizing the GDP as a measure of national health, starting in the Clinton era. And that's been very alienating for the American working class. And of course, Democrats, they were the drivers of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. They've been the drivers of any number of free trade deals, putting China into the, sort of global economy has been something that Democrats have prioritized over the last 30 years. So all of these things, during the 1990s, there was enough technologically driven prosperity in America and elsewhere that Democrats, and generally America as a whole, was quite willing to go along for the ride and to say, okay, maybe we're always going to have a telecom boom and a dot-com boom, and this is going to be the wave of the future. But as soon as that started to slow down in the 2000s, and as it has sort of petered out in the last 20 years, working class Americans have said, wait a minute, what did we give up in embracing China, in embracing these free trade deals? How has the Democratic Party betrayed us by pursuing these policies? So the Democrats, they're really in a identity crisis right now. They have lost what had been successful during the long period of the Franklin Roosevelt legacy, and they realize now that actually Bill Clinton never did put them on a firm footing, and that they only really get elected, especially to the White House, when Republicans monumentally screw up. And that was the case, in 2008 when Republicans had the Iraq War and the Great Recession to worry about, and so that elects Barack Obama. And then in 2020, you had COVID, you had the George Floyd riots, any number of other things going on, which helped to elect Joe Biden that year. But the Democrats, they're not getting elected on the basis of their own strengths. They're only getting elected on the basis of Republicans wandering into disasters that they're not able to get themselves out of. So I think it's a party right now that's kind of wandering in the wilderness.
Yeah, it's a really useful potted history of the 20th century in America, and that's very helpful. You know, the thing that I take away from that and from things I've been reading over the past few years, and it echoes things that have happened in the UK since the 1990s as well, of course, is that there has been this kind of pincer movement of economic folly on one hand, where more and more globalism, less and less domestic manufacturing or domestic energy independence, and all those other things that we used to think were good. And at the same time, there's been this kind of cultural movement as well towards the embrace of ever more crazy woke policies, transgenderism being the obvious example, but other policies to do with race, the hatred for history, the idea that our nations were born in sin. I mean, all these kind of cultural phenomena that have sprung up over the past few years. And you increasingly get the impression that the working classes across the Western world feel both economically insecure and culturally insecure, and are looking for people who promise to solve those two issues. On the cultural side of it, I think you've just given a really useful outline there about economic shifts that have taken place and how Trump is trying to address them. In relation to the cultural sphere and the problem of wokeness, which I think is still an important one, how is Trump faring on that front? I loved some of the flurry of executive orders he came in with, especially in relation to trans and the inclusion of men in women's sports, etc. How have they held up? Are they still under challenge? Do you think they will go through? Do you think wokeness has been put to bed in the way that some people claim, or is it still a problem?
Yeah, I'm skeptical that wokeness has been defeated once and for all. Trump has been very successful, and his policies, with regard to wokeness, seem to be quite popular. And Democrats right now, even though they can't quite bring themselves philosophically or ideologically to abandon the trans cause, they also are being very careful not to promote it very heavily in their campaigns. So we have elections coming up in Virginia and New Jersey in about 10 days or so, 2 weeks. And Democrats in both places are very careful to try to keep as low a profile as possible on those issues. They don't want to remind voters, especially women, that they support, putting men in women's sports. They support, putting men in women's bathrooms. They support putting men in women's rape shelters. I mean, anywhere where you could possibly include men, who are superficially claiming to be women. These are dudes with beards and, they're just putting on a dress and then walking into women's private spaces, claiming to be trans and getting away with it because progressives have absolutely no standards by which they're holding anyone to. So that's all been quite successful. By the way, there's another dimension I should mention, which is sort of partly cultural and partly economic. And this is a real problem for Democrats looking at the future. It's true that Trump has this successful working class appeal based on tariffs and other things. But the other dimension that has to be kept in mind is that in the states in America, the red states, the Republican states, states with Republican governors and Republican legislatures, they're doing much better economically. They are much more prosperous. It's much easier to start a business. So this is a component of the Republican coalition that libertarians should be happy about. They also have much better population growth rates, partly from in-migration, that you have migration from Democrat-run states to Republican states. You've got a great exodus of population out of California, which is a Democratic state, and into Texas, which is a Republican state. And then also the birth rates are rather better, and family formation is easier in the Republican states. This means that basically the Democrats right now are at such a strong demographic disadvantage that the next time there's a census, which is going to be in 2030, the Republicans are going to gain a lot of seats in Congress, which also is going to add to the Republican seats or Republican votes in the electoral Congress, the electoral college rather, which is what ultimately determines American presidential elections. So the demographics right now of the United States are moving in a direction that is very favorable to the GOP and very bad for the Democrats, and that is something that the Democrats should be considering, as a sort of three-alarm fire, as an existential threat to their very party. Because if this keeps up, the Democrats are going to be in a permanent minority in Congress, and they're also going to be very much at a disadvantage in presidential elections.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure of meeting some of those exiled Californians who've gone to Texas, and they are interesting people fleeing what they consider to be a failing state under the Democrats there in California. That brings me on to another issue that I wanted to touch on with you, which is a different form of movements of people, the movements of foreign people into the United States, particularly on the southern border, the migrant crisis, problems to do with porous borders that America has had for some time. Um, Not quite as bad as Europe's porous borders, but still not in great shape over the past few years. Trump has taken some pretty extraordinary measures to resolve this problem, including deporting illegal immigrants, promising to quite severely restrict the flow of people across the southern border. We've seen some anti-ICE protests in America, of course, and a lot of anger. It seems to me that it's not that kind of anger about it is not connecting culturally in the way that it might have done 5 or 10 years ago. And the one reason I'm saying this is because that kind of politics has not impacted on the British left in a meaningful way, in the way that the post-Floyd moment did, for example. Like the British left was completely colonized, culturally colonized by BLM, by wokeness, by all these ideas that primarily come from the left in America. Those ideas washed over the British left and controlled their way of thinking for a period of time. That seems to be happening less and less now, I feel. So what's the temperature around the issue of immigration? Are these Trump policies also popular? Is the left pushback having any impact at all? What's that issue like at the moment?
Yeah, so on the one hand, polling produces mixed results about how popular Trump's policy is. Um, but I think when you take the polling about Trump's policies in the context of polling about alternatives, Trump's policies actually are quite popular indeed. So, there are concerns about is Trump being too heavy-handed? There are other concerns, sometimes on the part of the right, is Trump going far enough? Certainly with some of the visas that cover immigration from India for professionals working in the tech sector, there's concern on the right that Trump is talking a big game, but is actually not delivering quite as much as he promised. So we have this thing called the H-1B visa, which is almost a form of indentured servitude. It basically says we're going to bring over workers from India on the pretext that we can't find computer programmers here in America. And these workers are basically bound to their jobs when they come over to the United States, which means that they have very few protections or very, very little bargaining power with their employers. And as a result, they are paid less than Americans for the same kind of work. And so it's, a very bad problem for America's computer programmers themselves, but also it creates this, sort of steady stream of immigration. And then as far as the southern border is concerned, what's great, I mean, a number of things are happening. Not only do you have Trump taking, a pretty hard line within the country, deporting people who are overstaying their visas, deporting people who are here illegally, but the knock-on effects of this have kind of demonstrated the truth, one of the very few truths of Mitt Romney, who had been, this Republican who had run for president in 2012 and was a senator for a few years. But one thing Romney said in 2012 was that he wanted to see a phenomenon he called self-deportation. And he wanted to basically create a sense of discouraging illegal immigrants from coming to America in the first place. And that seems to have taken hold, that, to the nations to our south, there is a much greater awareness that you don't want to come and cross that border and come to America illegally, because you won't be allowed to stay, you won't be allowed to work, you will not get a friendly reception. And so basically don't uproot yourself and give up the life you have in your own country, because, if you're not coming to America legally, you're not going to be wanted. And the legal process, it's a mess, unfortunately. I mean, I think all Americans would like to see, immigrants who have meritorious cases for coming to the United States to be able to do so more easily. But, for a variety of reasons, partly having to do with the volume and partly having to do with the fact that illegal immigrants are always jumping the queue, it's extremely difficult to get, to put order into the American legal immigration system. And so that, too, is quite clogged and generally not very easy to get through. So as a result, I think, not only is the policy having a direct result, but it's also having this indirect result of discouraging lawbreaking, discouraging migration flows. And that's a very positive thing as well.
Yeah, we're still waiting for some British policy that would discourage similar things that are happening in the English Channel, those kind of dangerous illegal journeys that are taking place every single day. And we haven't had that kind of discouraging policy that Trump has managed to implement. I wanted to ask you about Trump's foreign policy. And you and have both been critics of overbearing American foreign policy and unnecessary interventions overseas that have taken place over the past 20 years. And, some Democrat warmongers had a real thirst for those kinds of interventions in recent decades. Trump, of course, has a different approach, which is that he, as you said earlier, he wants to bring wars to an end rather than start new wars. We've got the Gaza peace deal. Everyone hopes that stands up and that the war comes to a close. Iran seems to have been put back in its box in a quite neat way. We didn't have to have a 20-year war like in Afghanistan or anything else in order to try and solve some of those problems in Iran. Ukraine-Russia, however, is a lot more sticky. And it does sometimes seem to me that although Trump is still devoted to winding that war down, bringing that war to an end, it does seem to be a huge challenge for him. And as an outside observer, it seems that he flits a little bit between some days being very, very anti-Zelensky, other days being incredibly frustrated with Putin, which I guess is a measure of the fact that this is at the moment, a pretty intractable conflict. What do you think the White House intends to do next in relation to that conflict in particular? And will it be read as a failure on the part of Trump's pacifist foreign policy or his desire to end wars if they don't manage to end that war?
Yeah, Trump is certainly very frustrated right now with both Zelensky and Putin. It seems that both Zelensky and Putin believe that certainly they can continue the war indefinitely, and they're both hopeful that they're going to get what they want out of it. The Ukrainians are, being more and more bold about launching drone strikes and other kinds of attacks against Russia itself. And I have to say, while, in conventional terms, the Ukrainians are completely outmanned by this massive Russian force, the reality is that in the 21st century, you can use drones to make up for a lot of that manpower shortage. So even though the Ukrainians have a great problem right now in terms of finding enough men to serve in their army, they're able to make up for some of that deficit with drones. So you're seeing war itself kind of evolve in this conflict. So Zelensky thinks that he can keep going for some time still. And similarly, Putin thinks that, as long as he keeps up the pressure, eventually the Ukrainians will weaken and he'll be able to grab more of Ukraine. So Trump has been rebuffed by both sides. And it's certainly something that is annoying Trump a great deal. An annoyed Trump is a Trump who might be willing to just, keep things as they are and let these, two sides continue to kill one another until they, come to their senses and decide to seek peace. Or it might be that Trump, tries to change the dynamics somewhat, and he's got obviously much more leverage over Ukraine than he does over Russia. It is, I think, commendable and at least noteworthy that Trump keeps at it. I mean, he does keep trying to, bring about negotiations directly between Putin and Zelensky. He does keep trying to, talk to both leaders and trying to, jawbone them into, coming to some sort of agreement. But of course, it's intractable. Now, it took a very long time to get the Gaza deal together, and it's taking longer to do Ukraine and Russia. But he's continuing to keep up the pressure, and it's clear that he would like to have a resolution very badly. And so I think this is going to be a matter of it really is up to Ukraine and Russia to realize that the war is damaging both of their countries in a very serious way, and that they're both going to be much worse off than they realize if this continues. And there's a limit to how much pressure Trump can bring externally on either one of them.
I guess as a follow-on question for what you said earlier about Trump's trade policy possibly outlasting his administration, certainly if the Democrats come to their senses and recognize that these are popular measures amongst the working classes, that they expect an element of protection. Is it possible that his foreign policy, his approach to winding wars down and taking America somewhat out of conflictual situations around the world, is it possible that will live beyond his administration as well? I mean, it's hard to read, but when one thinks of the Democrat thirst for war over the past few years, I mean, one thinks of Hillary Clinton or monstrous figures like Samantha Power, for example, people who were incredibly keen to drag America into wars overseas in Libya and Syria and elsewhere. And of course, Republicans. One can never forget the George W. Bush administration and the disaster of the Iraq War. Is this a vibe shift in terms of foreign policy as well? Is there now a taste amongst ordinary Americans to have fewer of those awful wars that America has been involved in recent decades, and a desire to bring troops home and for American resources to be devoted to protecting the homeland rather than invading countries overseas?
I will say that it's been very interesting seeing the National Guard deployed. I mean, I'm here in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. Courts have just, approved Trump's desire to send National Guard troops to Portland, one of these Democratic cities that's very troubled. So it's been remarkable to see the troops literally come home. And frankly, the lawlessness in some of America's cities has been so extreme that this has been a very good thing. And it's when the left talks about this, they report it hysterically and they're saying, oh, we've got American troops in American cities. Isn't this fascism? Isn't this, a military takeover? It actually is the farthest thing from that. So you have, these National Guard troops, and the National Guard, they're not full-time military personnel. These are, sometimes called, semi-affectionately but semi-mockingly weekend warriors. They sign up and they do military service, on weekends and basically interstitially. And so, they come to these cities and they're just a visible presence. They're not actually, for the most part, engaged in direct law enforcement, but what they're doing is simply reminding people that, there is a source of authority. They are actually creating environments where the law enforcement and security people within our own cities, so state and local officials, are able to do their jobs much more effectively simply because criminals say, hey, wait a minute, there's a soldier standing there. I don't want to be quite as obstreperous as I normally am. And as a result, the police and, security in our train stations and elsewhere, they're able to say to the drug addicts and the homeless and others, watch your step, and if you're going to behave badly, get the heck out of here, because not only are we here, but we've also got these troops backing us up. So I think Americans are, they're partly encouraged by that. And this is a case where there are a number of Democrats and a number of constituencies that typically vote Democrat in America's cities that are actually kind of more relieved by this than they dare let on. And so even white liberals in a city like Washington, D.C., they'll condemn what Trump's doing. They'll say this is terrible. But then if you go down the line and ask them more deeply, do you feel a little bit safer? Even they will acknowledge they do. And certainly if you ask taxi drivers or Uber drivers who are exposed to the generally chaotic conditions, they will say, it's a huge improvement. So that's working out well. Americans don't have an appetite for further wars like Afghanistan or Iraq. There is still a kind of residual belief in America as a kind of worldwide guarantor of security, in the form of supporting NATO, supporting other allies, whether it's, in East Asia or Israel or any number of other places. So that hasn't completely changed. But there is a much greater reluctance now to engage in the kind of nation building and democracy promotion that had happened, not only among, not only during the George W. Bush administration, but with these Democrats as well, like Bill Clinton, and to some extent, actually to a considerable extent, Barack Obama. So that does seem to be a phase that we have now passed beyond in American politics. The Democrats, they will, if they get power again, want to try to get us more deeply involved in various ways in Europe, supporting NATO to a greater extent, and generally trying to re-internationalize or re-globalize American foreign policy. Even they probably realize that they don't have a carte blanche from the American voters to get us into invasions or large-scale military conflicts. So there's really this battle being fought right now on just the extent to which America is going to be this kind of guarantor, or the extent to which America is going to insist that our allies be more proactive in their own regions in taking care of their neighborhoods and putting out fires in their own neighborhoods. And that's the philosophical battle that's being fought not only between Republicans and Democrats, but to some extent within each party as well.
In relation to domestic security, the question of crime, keeping streets safe, and You say there that, some white liberals make a big show of criticizing some of these measures while secretly liking them because life becomes more pleasant. I think beyond those kinds of influential white liberals, people underestimate at their peril how important community security is for working class people. No one is put out more by petty crime, shoplifting, murder, violence than working class communities, which these things tend to impact on more than others. Um, in relation to that, I wanted to come back to the question of Mamdani, who you've already mentioned, and he looks set to become mayor of New York. That's freaking out quite a lot of people. It's probably freaking out the Democratic Party itself a little bit because they're not sure which direction they're going to go in the future in terms of what kind of politicians they want to push to the fore. It's my understanding that he has toned down some of his older views to do with abolitionist approach to the police, defund the police, those kind of slightly crazy woke views that he had for a period of time. He's a young person. He's allowed to have thought stupid things as recently as 10 years ago, I guess, or 5 years ago. What's the sense in a city like New York, which is a huge, bustling, crazy city where there are problems of crime and antisocial behavior? Are there concerns amongst certain constituencies, including, I guess, the native working class, the New Yorker working class, that someone like Mamdani might not be able to police the city in the way that they anticipate? Is there a sense that he might be a danger for New York? What's the reading there?
Well, there is concern about that. On the other hand, New York is such a kind of strong city and is so thoroughly organized that it's unlikely that even a fairly radical mayor would be able to change things quite as dramatically as one might fear. In particular, I mean, New York actually is one of the more controlled cities where crime is concerned, and that's because the New York City Police Department is it's the size of basically other countries' armies. It is a very large force. It is a political force unto itself as well, which is one reason why even Zohran Mamdani has walked back his more radical claims. No politician in New York wants to make an enemy out of the police, simply because there are a lot of voters there, and a lot of voters who aren't police officers themselves, who don't have police family, nonetheless consider the police to be, a vital part of the city. And again, that's not an embrace of authoritarianism. That's, New York would be Afghanistan. I mean, it would be anarchy, if you didn't have a very substantial law enforcement element. So that's a reality of New York City that Mamdani can't change easily, even if he wanted to. And the big question is exactly how radical Mamdani will be when he almost certainly gets elected in about 2 weeks here. Um, is his moderation simply, an attempt to assuage voters, and then he's going to revert to his more radical self as soon as he gets elected? Will he, in fact, get elected and then become even more moderate as he, tries to be successful as a mayor and to have New York be a safe city and a prosperous city and not a city where, businessmen are leaving or where the working class feels like they have to flee? These are open questions. And of course, it's a terrible risk for New York voters to take. And the reason it has to be taken is because the Democrats, stupidly, the party establishment tried to put up the former governor of New York, Cuomo, as the alternative to Mamdani in the mayoral primaries. And Cuomo was such a disaster as governor. I mean, between sexual harassment problems and a COVID policy that was insane and that basically killed off, all sorts of old people. Cuomo was such a disaster that, Mamdani was able to beat him, even as a very inexperienced politician who was seen as quite radical. The fact is, Cuomo is just so repellent that Mamdani easily triumphed in that primary. And now Cuomo is being a sore loser and is still running an independent candidacy against Mamdani. He's losing. There are a lot of calls by American billionaires saying that the actual Republican candidate in the mayor race, which is Curtis Sliwa, who was the founder of the Guardian Angels vigilante group in the 1980s. Sliwa is, he's unlikely to win. New Yorkers don't vote for Republicans, but Sliwa is an actual New Yorker. He's someone whose, heart and soul is in the city. And, he's someone who actually, is a guy who cares about New York in a real concrete way, and it comes through in his interviews. And it's really disgusting to see a lot of billionaires, in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, or on Wall Street, say that Sliwa should be the one to drop out to give Cuomo, a slight boost against Mamdani. when in fact, I mean, Cuomo is just so repellent that I don't see any scenario in which he wins. So in this three-way race, Mamdani is almost certainly going to win, and it's going to be a rough time for New York. I do think Mamdani might be pragmatic enough that he's going to realize his future in American politics is going to depend on New York being a successful city, a safe and prosperous one, and therefore he might not go as far as he's discussed. On the other hand, I mean, Mamdani, I mean, he crazy ideas pop into his head all the time, whether it's about having, you know, uh, basically making grocery stores, sort of having government-run grocery stores, so taking a leaf out of the book of the Soviet Union there, or various kinds of controls on rent and housing and strengthening some of these rent controls, which actually make housing very difficult in New York. So he is a socialist who has a variety of very old school socialist views, and those are going to be problematic enough for New York. If he then goes even further and adopts woke views and carries on this anti-police agenda, which he had previously been signaling during the George Floyd era, that would be an absolute catastrophe for New York.
Absolutely. I thought the Democratic establishment's reliance on Cuomo in New York was such a sign of the times, such a sign of what a sclerotic party it has become. And, you know, part of you even hopes Mamdani shows them up, not that we necessarily want him to be mayor of New York, but at least it will teach the Democrats a lesson that they probably need to learn. My last issue for you, Daniel, is just in relation to, I guess, America post Charlie Kirk. And so we had the killing of Charlie Kirk last month in September. Absolutely shocking scenes went around the world, of course. It was incredibly horrendous and indicative of, I guess, well, according to some observers, indicative of a violence creeping into American politics. Now, that can be exaggerated. There isn't that much violence in American politics. But it did seem to some like a kind of militarized expression of cancel culture, a very extreme expression of campus intolerance, which is something that has been gathering pace for some time. How did you read the assassination of Charlie Kirk? What have its consequences been for political discussion in the US?
Well, you're quite right that the Charlie Kirk murder was part of a larger trend. And even though very few of these so-called Antifa elements and, campus radicals, even though very few of them get to an extremely violent point, and even fewer actually commit murder, nevertheless, there is a kind of atmosphere of menace that they create. And they kind of they work in collaboration in a sense, if not consciously, then certainly effectively, with university administrations, which are often very left-wing. And what happens is Antifa will make threats. They'll say, we're going to protest violently. We can't be held responsible if someone throws, incendiary devices or other kinds of, or creates a riot-like environment. We're going to protest and we expect it's going to get violent. And then university administrations will then tell conservative speakers coming to campus or professors with unpopular views, they'll say, well, we can't have you on our campus. We would have to have, or if you want to come, you have to pay enormous insurance fees. You have to provide your own security. Basically, we will price you out of the ability to speak on our campus by giving in to this intimidation coming from the Antifa activist left. So that's the way in which the left is able to silence a lot of debate on America's campuses. And I think a lot of people are fed up with that. And you already are seeing some talk about, treating Antifa as an almost Ku Klux Klan-like organization. That, okay, they may not be as rigidly organized as the Ku Klux Klan has been at times, but the operation is actually very similar. The Ku Klux Klan doesn't actually, necessarily commit all that many murders. It does commit some, of course, but mostly it is an organization that survives on intimidation. And in that sense, it is very similar to Antifa. Antifa, of course, supposedly stands for anti-fascist, but in reality, the brown shirt tactics that Antifa follows are precisely the tactics that Mussolini's brown shirts had followed in terms of intimidating political opponents, bringing violence into politics, At first, mostly at the level of intimidation and, street fighting and so forth. And then, with murderous violence kind of on the margins, but nevertheless, because it does happen in the case of a very prominent figure like Charlie Kirk, it is still a threat that looms there for, everyone else. So I think the Trump administration wants to take this on. The universities, they're very reluctant to admit how inadequate their response to this intimidation has been. And right now, they're trying to resist the Trump administration's pressure to take these threats more seriously. And they are rejecting the deals that the Trump administration is trying to make with them. The Trump administration is holding their federal funding hostage. And I think, from my point of view, Trump shouldn't even negotiate with these people because they're lunatics. He should simply withdraw their federal funding and, let's start new universities. Let's not continue to reward these people who have both, as academics in creating, insane categories of gender studies and other nonsense, and as administrators who put up with this kind of violence from Antifa. Um, on both grounds, these universities don't deserve a dime of taxpayer money. But the universities are very reluctant to reform themselves. And so there's a pressure. I think that Americans are not fearful of day-to-day violence, in American politics, but there is this sense of menace that is coming mostly from the left right now, and the left, of course, has been extremely hypocritical about this. They will, come up with some very fanciful statistics claiming, oh, the real threat's coming from the right. But the fact is, I mean, it's like dealing with an alcoholic, right? When you confront an alcoholic friend and say you have a problem, they turn around and say, well, you're not perfect yourself. That doesn't matter. You might be imperfect, but someone who is an alcoholic needs to look in the mirror and address their own problems, and then we can deal with other people's problems after that. And similarly, the American left wants to say, hey, there's a political violence problem on the right too. Well, there may be, but that doesn't mean that the left doesn't have to deal in an emergency way with what's happening on the left right now, and the way in which not only have you had, a left-wing murderer assassinate Charlie Kirk, but then you had these lefties joking about it or saying it was a good thing. It's not that most of those people are going to go violent, but they certainly are just reprehensible in terms of their view, and in viewing, their fellow Americans as being enemies who deserve death, as opposed to political opponents who they might want to defeat, but who otherwise deserve respect and certainly deserve their lives.
I think you're absolutely right about the culture of menace that actually always attends censorship, because censorship contains within it the promise at least of menace and sometimes of violence, because if you transgress these carefully policed moral boundaries, then you can be punished in some way. You might be hounded off campus, you might be prevented from speaking, you might be threatened with menacing behavior. There's always a culture of threat around censorship, and we've seen that on campuses over the past few years in America and Britain. Even though acts of violence are very rare, there is the promise of it in these threats, don't say these things or else. So my final question then is on this question of freedom of speech, and you kind of answered it a little bit by saying that, the universities are not going to play ball, and you think Trump should just take away the money and do something else, create a new university system, one that actually values freedom and knowledge and intellectual experimenting, rather than these old campuses which absolutely do not value those things. Um, but the vibe shift, that overused term vibe shift, do you think we will see one in relation to freedom of speech? Do you think we will see America rediscover its love for freedom of speech? And is Trump the ideal person for that kind of vibe shift? Is Trump a trustworthy friend of freedom of speech, or a flighty friend of freedom of speech? How do you see that great liberty going forward in Trump's America?
Freedom of speech, like other freedoms, is a thing which can be brought into being in two different ways. So, on the one hand, you can have a very principled philosophical approach to freedom of speech and try to get that enacted. But of course, sometimes people who talk a lot about having a free speech ideology or free speech philosophy don't actually practice it, or are able to sneak through various kinds of censorship in the cracks within their philosophy. Then the second way of making sure that a liberty like that is effective is simply having an open clash of people with different ideas. And they may not have an overarching philosophy of free speech, but because everyone is fighting for their own free speech, the net effect is to have free speech for everyone. And I think that latter scenario is more of what we're seeing in America. So Trump is certainly not consistent in terms of having a philosophy of free speech. But because he does so much to disrupt the blockades on free speech, simply by his own actions and by putting pressure on the people who've been the most effective censors in America, which are those on the left, he has effectively done a great service for free speech. And then you have, figures like Elon Musk, who, again, he can be very inconsistent as well in his free speech policies, including on X, the app formerly known as Twitter. Nevertheless, it is a much more robust discussion right now on the X app than you had during its days as Twitter, especially its last days as Twitter. So I think free speech is actually doing well based on the conflicts that are being fought in America. And the idea that everyone wants some degree of free speech. They may be inconsistent about, according it to their opponents, but because they're fighting so hard defensively for their own free speech rights, I think it's starting to have the effect of making free speech more robust. Certainly the discourse in America right now is much more freewheeling and much more open than it has been in decades. So I see that as being a victory for free speech, even though, in terms of anyone having a consistent philosophy on either the right or the left, one will have to, turn over stones and kind of look in the darkest recesses to find people who are really consistent and principled on this issue. But overall, I think simply the clash of competing interests is doing what James Madison had hoped it would do, and is generating an environment in which free speech actually does become freer.
Daniel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks again to PIA VPN for sponsoring this episode. Take control of your digital life and get PIA for 86% off. Click the link in the description below or scan the QR code.